Welcome to 558 Whispered Truths. If you love stories about family drama, betrayal, and fierce resilience, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and ring the bell so you never miss the drama. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your stories too. The moment I saw him across that crowded backyard in Portland, something shifted inside me. Mark was leaning against the deck railing, laughing at something his friend had said, completely unaware that he had just changed the trajectory of my entire life. The summer air was thick with the scent of barbecue and possibility. I wasn't looking for love that day. In fact, I'd promised myself I would focus on my career, on building something for myself, before letting anyone else into my life. But fate has a way of making you break your own rules. "You should go talk to him," my friend whispered, nudging me with her elbow. "He keeps looking over here." That first conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked as the sky turned from blue to orange to deep purple. When everyone else had left, we were still there, sitting on porch steps, sharing dreams and fears like old friends reuniting after years apart. Mark was different from anyone I'd ever met. He listened, really listened, when I spoke. His eyes would crinkle at the corners when he smiled, and he had this way of making me feel like the most important person in any room. Within weeks, I knew I was falling hard, but I was still determined to build my own foundation. 6 months into our relationship, I found it a little craftsman fixer-upper on a quiet street with mature trees. The real estate agent winced as she showed me around, pointing out the water damage, the outdated electrical, the crumbling back porch. But where others saw problems, I saw potential. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked as we walked through the empty rooms, our voices echoing against bare walls. "It needs everything." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "This is mine. Something I built. Something no one can take from me." The closing paperwork felt heavy in my hands. My name, just my name, on the deed. I'd never owned anything so substantial before, and the weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. Every spare dollar I had went into that house. Weekends disappeared under coats of paint and renovation dust. I learned to use power tools, to lay tile, to negotiate with contractors when jobs were beyond my skills. Mark was there through it all, handing me nails, holding ladders steady, ordering takeout when we were too exhausted to cook. Never once did he question why I needed to do this alone, why his name wasn't on those papers. He understood independence in a way I didn't fully appreciate at the time. 2 years into our relationship, standing in the kitchen I had rebuilt with my own hands, Mark got down on one knee. The ring was simple. He knew I preferred practical over flashy, but the promise behind it was everything I'd ever wanted. "You rebuilt this house," he said, voice husky with emotion. "Would you build a life with me in it?" Our wedding was small, just close friends and family in our backyard. The garden I'd planted was in full bloom, and fairy lights twinkled overhead as we danced under the stars. That night, when Mark carried me over the threshold of my house, our house now in every way except the legal paperwork, I felt complete. For months, everything was perfect. Mark moved his things in, and we settled into a rhythm of shared coffee mornings and lazy Sunday afternoons. I'd finally found my place in the world, my person, my home. I thought nothing could shake the foundation we'd built, but I hadn't fully understood what I was marrying into. Mark's family, particularly his mother, Patricia, was deeply traditional. The first time they visited our home, I watched Patricia's eyes narrow as Mark proudly showed off the renovations my wife had done. Her smile never reached her eyes. "It's quaint," she said, her voice clipped as she ran a finger along the countertop I'd installed myself, though I would have expected my son to provide a home for his bride, not the other way around. Mark squeezed my hand under the table. "Actually, Mom, we both like that she bought this place herself. We're equal partners here." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line as she exchanged glances with Mark's brothers and their wives. No one spoke, but the message was clear. I had broken some unwritten rule of their family dynamic. I hadn't just bought a house. I'd challenged a hierarchy I didn't even know existed. As they left that evening, Patricia hugged me stiffly. Family is everything to us, dear, she whispered, her fingers digging slightly into my shoulders. The Johnson men need strong women behind them, supporting their decisions. Remember that. I smiled and nodded, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. Something told me this woman wasn't just giving friendly advice. She was issuing a warning. And as the taillights of their car disappeared down our street, I couldn't shake the feeling that the home I'd worked so hard to build was suddenly on shaky ground. I should have known that first dinner wouldn't be the last time Patricia tried to assert her control. The warnings were there like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, but I was too wrapped up in my newlywed bliss to see the tempest brewing. 2 months after our wedding, Mark suggested hosting Sunday dinner for his entire family. "It'll be good," he promised, squeezing my hand. "We just need to see us in our element." Together. I spent all weekend preparing, scrubbing, polishing, cooking Mark's mother's own pot roast recipe to the letter. When the doorbell rang, I plastered on my most welcoming smile, determined to bridge whatever gap existed between us. Patricia swept in like royalty, entering a questionable establishment. Her eyes scanned our living room, lingering on the family photos where Mark and I stood equal in height and prominence. No demure bride gazing adoringly at her husband in those frames. Just 2 partners, arms wrapped around each other, facing the world together. "The house looks different," she remarked, emphasis heavy on the last word. "You've certainly put your stamp on things, haven't you?" Mark's brothers and their wives filed in behind her, a united front of pressed shirts and judgmental glances. The women immediately gravitated toward Patricia in the kitchen, leaving me to feel like an outsider in my own home. "Need any help?" I offered, setting down a tray of appetizers. "We've got it under control," Patricia answered without looking up. "Mothers and daughters have a system. You wouldn't understand." The barb stung, but I swallowed my retort. Peace. This was about peace. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The roast was perfect, the conversation polite, if somewhat stilted. I was just beginning to relax when Patricia set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Mark, your father and I have been discussing your situation," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone mothers use when they rehearse their speech. "We think it's time to put things in proper order." Mark's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What situation, Mom?" "This house arrangement." She waved her hand dismissively around our dining room, the room where I'd stripped wallpaper for 3 days straight, where I'd installed crown molding with bleeding fingers. "It's unnatural for a wife to own the marital home. The property should be in your name." The table fell silent. I felt the blood drain from my face as 5 pairs of eyes turned to gauge my reaction. "That's an interesting perspective," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "From 1952. Patricia's smile tightened. "Marriage is a sacred institution with roles that have stood the test of time. A wife doesn't own property separate from her husband. It creates division where there should be unity." My hands began to shake under the table. This house, my house, represented every extra shift I'd worked, every vacation I'd skipped, every penny I'd saved. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was my independence given physical form. "Actually," I said, feeling Mark's hand find mine under the table, "I bought this house before we were married. I renovated it. I paid for it. And with all due respect, Patricia, the deed will stay in my name." The temperature in the room plummeted. Mark's oldest brother cleared his throat awkwardly, while his wife studied her plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "I see," Patricia said, her voice arctic. "So you admit it then, you're after my son's money." "Mom!" Mark's voice cut through the tension. "That's completely unfair. If anything, she's the one protecting her assets from me." "No son of mine needs to be, quote, protected from," Patricia snapped. "The Johnsons have always provided for their wives. Your father gave me everything I could want. Your brothers have done the same for their wives." She gestured to the silent women flanking her, who nodded on cue like well-trained puppets. "Times change, Mom," Mark said firmly, "and I'm proud of what my wife has accomplished. I'm proud to be married to a woman strong enough to build her own foundation." Patricia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Strong women support their husbands, they don't emasculate them." Something inside me snapped. "Is that what you think I'm doing? Emasculating him by owning property? By having financial independence?" "I think," Patricia said, dabbing her lips primly with a napkin, "that you're setting a dangerous precedent. Marriage isn't about mine and yours. It's about becoming one unit." "One unit under whose control?" I challenged, feeling Mark's grip tighten on my hand. "Because it sounds like you're not upset about the separation of assets. You're upset that I'm the one with my name on the deed instead of your son." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face flushed deep red as she set down her napkin with deliberate care. "Mark deserves a wife who understands family values," she finally said. "Someone who appreciates the sacrifices a Johnson man makes. Someone grateful enough to show proper respect." "I respect my husband enough to see him as my equal," I replied, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Not as my superior or my inferior." Patricia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor I'd refinished by hand. "Well, I can see this dinner is over. Come, everyone. Clearly we're not welcome in my son's, I'm sorry, in my daughter-in-law's home." The exodus was swift and silent. Mark's brothers and their wives filed out like soldiers, not meeting our eyes. Only Patricia lingered in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "Mark," she said, ignoring me completely, "when you're ready to talk about proper family arrangements, your father and I will be waiting." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of her floral perfume and the heavy weight of her disapproval. Mark closed the door behind them and leaned his forehead against it. For a terrible moment, I wondered if I'd gone too far, if defending my independence would cost me my marriage. Then he turned, and the look in his eyes made my heart swell. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I had no idea she would do that." "Are you upset with me?" I asked, voicing my deepest fear. "For not backing down?" He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my face in his hands. "I have never been prouder to call you my wife," he whispered fiercely. "And this house? It's ours because we choose to share it, not because some paper says so." As we cleared the half-eaten dinner, stacking plates still warm with food no one had finished, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the opening salvo. Patricia Johnson had declared war on my independence, and she didn't strike me as a woman accustomed to losing. The sanctuary I'd built with my own 2 hands suddenly felt vulnerable, as if the very foundations might shift beneath my feet. But one thing was certain: I wouldn't surrender without a fight. Not my house, not my marriage, not the life I'd worked so hard to build. Whatever Patricia had planned next, she would learn that I wasn't the meek daughter-in-law she'd hoped for. I was a woman who owned her own home, and I was just getting started. Patricia's Cold War began the moment we closed the door on that disastrous Sunday dinner. The silence from her end was deafening. Phone calls ceased, holiday invitations disappeared, and the weekly family gatherings continued without us, as if we'd been erased from the Johnson family history. Mark tried to hide his pain, but I caught him staring at his phone sometimes, thumb hovering over his mother's contact. "It's her loss," he'd say when he noticed me watching, forcing a smile that never quite reached his eyes. We decided to fill the void with our own traditions. Sunday brunches with mimosas on our back patio, monthly dinner parties with friends who celebrated our partnership rather than questioning it. We planted a garden together in the backyard, something tangible growing from the soil of our shared life. I never realized how much energy I spent trying to please my mother. Mark confessed one evening as we sat under the stars in our garden. "It's exhausting, constantly seeking approval you never receive." I squeezed his hand. "You don't need to earn love, Mark. Real love doesn't come with conditions attached." 6 months into Patricia's silence, we found ourselves in a position to buy a second property, a small cabin near the lake where Mark had spent summers as a child. The investment made perfect sense. Property values in the area were rising steadily, and we both loved the idea of having a weekend retreat. We should buy it together, Mark suggested, his eyes holding mine with significance. Both our names on the deed, equal partners. I knew what this meant. A deliberate rejection of his mother's outdated beliefs, a statement about our marriage that went beyond words. Are you sure? I asked. Your mother will see this as direct defiance. I'm counting on it, he replied with a wry smile. Maybe it's time she understood this isn't just your stance, it's ours. The day we closed on the cabin, Mark posted a photo of us holding the keys on social media with the caption, "New adventure, equal partners every step of the way." I knew his family would see it. Part of me wondered if that was precisely the point. The response came swifter than I expected. Patricia called Mark that very evening. "She's turning you against your family," her voice crackled through the speaker, loud enough for me to hear even though Mark hadn't put her on speakerphone. "This isn't how we raised you. The Johnson men provide for their wives, not the other way around." Mark's knuckles went white around the phone. "Mom, we're providing for each other. That's what marriage means to us." "That woman has poisoned your mind against everything we stand for," Patricia continued, each word dripping with venom. "First her house, now this cabin. What's next? Will you be taking her last name too?" "That woman is my wife," Mark replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she has a name." "She's manipulating you," Patricia insisted. "Can't you see it? First she refuses to put your name on her house, and now she's forced you to put her name on this new property. She's controlling you through real estate, for God's sake." I watched Mark's face transform. That patient expression he typically wore when dealing with his mother hardening into something I'd never seen before. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching at his temple. "No one is forcing me to do anything," he said, each word precise and measured. "For the first time in my life, I'm making my own decisions, Mom. My wife isn't controlling me. She's supporting me in becoming my own person, something you've fought against my entire life." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought Patricia might have hung up. "Your father is very disappointed," she finally said, playing her ultimate card. Mark closed his eyes briefly. "Dad hasn't formed an original thought since 1975, Mom. We both know those are your words, not his." "How dare you!" Patricia's voice rose to a pitch I could hear clearly across the room. "After everything we've done for you!" "That's exactly the problem," Mark responded, his voice gaining strength. "Everything you've done came with strings attached. Every gift, every favor, they were all just tools to keep me in line. That's not love, Mom. That's control." I moved to leave the room, wanting to give him privacy, but Mark caught my hand, squeezing it tight, his eyes asking me to stay. "You need to choose, Mark," Patricia declared. "Either you come to your senses and return to this family's values, or you're choosing her over us." Mark didn't hesitate. "Then I choose her. I choose us. I choose the life we're building together as equals." The line went dead. Patricia had hung up. Mark set down the phone carefully, as if it might shatter at any moment. Or perhaps it was himself he feared might break. I sat beside him, saying nothing, just leaning my head against his shoulder. "You know what's the strangest part?" he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I feel terrible and free at the same time." I understood completely. Freedom often comes with its own kind of pain. That night, as we lay in bed, phones buzzing with outraged messages from Mark's brothers and their wives, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was what winning felt like. If so, victory tasted more bitter than I'd expected. "Do you regret it?" I whispered into the darkness. "Standing up to her that way?" Mark was quiet for so long I thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he turned toward me, his face barely visible in the moonlight filtering through our curtains. "My whole life, I've been the good son," he said. "The one who never rocked the boat, who always did what was expected. And you know what? It never made her happy. Nothing I did was ever enough." He reached out to brush a strand of hair from my face. "With you, I don't have to earn love by surrendering pieces of myself. I can just be. That's worth fighting for." A week later, the unexpected happened. A letter arrived, handwritten on clean stationery, addressed to both of us. The return address showed a name I didn't recognize. Margaret Donahue. My aunt, Mark explained, stunned. My mother's estranged sister. They haven't spoken in 15 years. The letter was brief, but powerful. Margaret had seen Mark's social media post about our cabin and heard through family grapevine about the conflict with Patricia. She wrote that history was repeating itself. Patricia had driven away her own sister years ago for similar controlling behavior. Your mother has always needed to be the center of every relationship, Margaret wrote. She doesn't understand love without dominance, but I've watched you grow into a man who sees differently, Mark. Don't let her dim that light. Some people will never approve of the joy they can't control. As I folded the letter, I realized something profound was happening between us. This wasn't just about property deeds or family traditions anymore. This was about breaking generational patterns, about choosing a different path forward. Patricia's campaign against me had backfired spectacularly. Instead of driving a wedge between us, she'd forged our partnership stronger in fire. As we stood at our kitchen window looking out at the garden we'd planted together, I couldn't help but find a metaphor in those growing things, how the strongest plants often come from the most resistant soil. We're going to be okay, I said, not as a question, but as a declaration. Mark nodded, his arm tightening around my waist. Better than okay, we're going to be ourselves. And in that moment, I realized that was the greatest victory of all. I thought Patricia's silent treatment was the worst she could do. I was devastatingly wrong. 3 weeks after Margaret's letter arrived, we received an official notice. Patricia had filed for conservatorship over Mark, claiming he was mentally incompetent and being manipulated by me. The legal document described him as unstable and, quote, under the undue influence of his controlling wife. Reading those words, my hands shook so violently that Mark had to take the papers from me. She's claiming I can't make my own decisions, he whispered, disbelief etched across his face. That I need to be legally protected from you. The betrayal cut deeper when we discovered all 3 of Mark's brothers had signed affidavits supporting Patricia's claims. They described incidents, some exaggerated, others completely fabricated, of Mark's erratic behavior since marrying me. According to them, buying property jointly was evidence of my manipulation and his declining judgment. They're making me sound insane, Mark said, his voice hollow as he flipped through the statements. Like I'm some puppet you're controlling. Our attorney assured us the case had little legal merit, but the emotional damage was already done. The family Mark had loved his entire life had essentially declared him incompetent, rather than accept our partnership of equals. I always knew they disagreed with our choices, Mark confessed one night, staring blankly at our bedroom ceiling. But I never thought they'd try to have me declared legally incapacitated. I held him as he finally broke down, his body shaking with sobs that had been building since that first confrontational phone call. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was psychological warfare. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for 3 months out, but Patricia wasn't content to wait. The harassment began subtly at first. Calls from unknown numbers, always hanging up when we answered. Then came the appearances, Patricia's car parked across from our house, or glimpses of her watching us from coffee shops we frequented. You're being paranoid, Mark's youngest brother told him when confronted. Mom's just concerned about you. If you'd stop this nonsense and put your name on that house like a normal husband, this would all go away. I started documenting everything, creating a paper trail of Patricia's escalating behavior. The day I installed security cameras around our property, Mark looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. I never thought we'd need protection from my own mother, he said. The cameras proved necessary sooner than we expected. 2 weeks later, they captured Patricia and Mark's oldest brother attempting to enter our home using a key we didn't know existed, apparently kept from when Mark had stayed with his parents briefly after college. When confronted with the footage, Patricia was unrepentant. I have every right to check on my son's welfare, she insisted. Who knows what she's doing to him in that house? We changed the locks that afternoon. Then came the credit inquiries. Someone, we never proved who, had attempted to open credit cards in our names, applied for loans using our information. Our mailbox was tampered with repeatedly. Anonymous complaints were filed against my business license. She's trying to destroy us financially, I realized, staring at another credit alert on my phone. Our attorney helped us file for a temporary restraining order, which the judge granted based on the mounting evidence. I thought it would give us breathing room, some semblance of peace, while we prepared for the conservatorship hearing. I was wrong again. Patricia violated the restraining order within days, showing up at my office, tearfully telling my colleagues she was, quote, just a concerned mother trying to save her son from an abusive relationship. The performance was so convincing that one of my coworkers actually confronted me, asking if I was holding Mark hostage at home. She's completely delusional, Margaret told us during a supportive phone call. This is exactly what happened when our father died. Patricia couldn't accept that I inherited half the family business. She convinced herself I'd somehow manipulated him, turned the entire family against me. How did it end? I asked, desperate for some blueprint to follow. Margaret's silence spoke volumes. I moved 3 states away and haven't spoken to my sister in 15 years, she finally answered. Sometimes there's no winning with someone who rewrites reality to suit their narrative. But we couldn't just move away. Our lives, my business, everything we'd built together was here. And running felt too much like admitting Patricia was right, that our relationship couldn't withstand scrutiny. The night before the conservatorship hearing, Mark and I sat in our garden, this space that had become our sanctuary. The plants we'd started together had flourished despite everything, stubborn in their determination to grow. No matter what happens tomorrow, Mark said, taking my hand, I need you to know I have never regretted choosing us, not for a single moment. Tears welled in my eyes. Even with all this? Especially with all this, he said firmly. Before you, I didn't know I could stand up for myself. I didn't know I deserved to. He gestured around us. This garden, our home, that cabin, they're just physical manifestations of what we've really built together. A life where we both matter equally. The morning of the hearing, we arrived at the courthouse to find Patricia already there, surrounded by Mark's brothers and their wives, all dressed immaculately, the picture of concerned family members. I felt suddenly conscious of how tired Mark and I looked, worn down by months of harassment and sleepless nights. Remember, our attorney whispered, they're counting on emotion. We have facts, documentation, and Mark's clearly sound mind. Don't let them provoke you. As we walked past the family phalanx, Patricia reached for Mark's arm. Sweetheart, it's not too late, she pleaded, her voice dripping with rehearsed maternal concern. We can help you. You don't have to live under her control anymore. Mark stopped, turned slowly toward his mother. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Mom, he said, his voice steady and clear, I love you. I always will. But this isn't love what you're doing. This is the opposite of love. He looked around at his brothers, their wives, these people who had been his world for so long. You've all chosen to believe I'm either crazy or weak, because I treat my wife as an equal. That says everything about you and nothing about me. With dignity I didn't know he still had reserves of, Mark turned away from them and took my hand. Together, we walked through the courtroom doors, ready to fight for the life we'd chosen. A life where property deeds didn't define our worth, where partnerships meant standing stronger together, not controlling one another. As the bailiff called the court to order, I squeezed Mark's hand. We both knew that whatever happened today, the real victory had already been won. We had refused to surrender to manipulation and fear. We had chosen respect over tradition, partnership over control. And at that moment, facing down the people who wanted to tear us apart, I had never felt stronger or more certain. Some battles are worth fighting, even when they break your heart along the way. The morning of the conservatorship hearing changed everything. Not because of what happened in court, but because of what we discovered hours before. Our lawyer called at dawn, his voice urgent. Check your email now. Someone just sent me something you need to see. Attached was a rental application for our home, not the one we owned, but our actual residence, dated 3 days earlier. The applicant? A woman named Helen Mercer, claiming our property would be vacant once the current occupants are removed. The landlord listed was Patricia Johnson. My hands trembled as I showed Mark. She's already planning to rent out our house. She genuinely believes she's going to win today and evict us. Mark's face went ashen. This isn't just controlling anymore. This is delusional. We forwarded everything to our attorney, who immediately filed it as supplemental evidence. But the real bombshell came an hour later when Margaret arrived at our door, clutching a weathered leather journal. I broke into Patricia's house last night, she confessed, her eyes red-rimmed. I know how that sounds, but after what you told me, I had to see if she kept her diaries the same way she did when we were young. She placed the journal on our kitchen table like it was radioactive. She always documented everything. Her grudges, her plans. It was her way of organizing her vendettas. Mark hesitated before opening it. But when he did, the color drained from his face. Inside were methodically dated entries spanning the last 18 months, beginning the day after we announced our engagement. Page after page detailed Patricia's growing obsession, plans to separate us, financial schemes to drain our resources, even disturbing fantasies about my accidental death. The most recent entries outlined how she would care for Mark once he was under her conservatorship, including plans to sell our home and move him back to the family estate. There's a whole section about tampering with your car brakes, Margaret whispered, pointing to an entry from just 2 weeks earlier. I felt physically ill. This isn't just controlling behavior. This is dangerous. Our attorney arrived 30 minutes later, reviewed the journal, and immediately called the judge's chambers. By the time we arrived at court, 2 police officers were waiting alongside a court-appointed psychiatrist. The scene that unfolded still haunts me. Patricia, seeing the journal in our attorney's hands, lunged across the courtroom screaming, "That's private! She stole my private thoughts! They've been manipulating everything!" It took both officers to restrain her as she thrashed and wailed, spitting venomous accusations that confirmed every disturbing word written in those pages. The conservatorship hearing never happened. Instead, the judge ordered Patricia to undergo psychiatric evaluation, temporarily committing her to a mental health facility based on the clear and immediate danger she posed. Mark's brothers stood stunned, their perfect family facade crumbling as their mother was led away, still shrieking that I had bewitched her son, stolen her property, turned her family against her. "Did you know?" Mark asked them afterward, his voice hollow. "Did you know she was planning to hurt us?" None would meet his eyes. One by one, they mumbled excuses and left, their own complicity too heavy to acknowledge. For 3 days, Mark barely spoke. I found him one night sitting in our garden, staring at nothing. I sat beside him, not touching, just present. "I keep thinking about all the times growing up when she'd say she was just protecting me," he finally said. "The friends she drove away. The girlfriends she sabotaged. I thought it was love." "Parts of it probably were," I answered softly, "but love twisted into something else." The psychiatric evaluation confirmed what we already knew. Patricia suffered from a severe personality disorder with paranoid features, exacerbated by underlying delusions about property and control. The court mandated long-term treatment and extended the restraining order indefinitely. Margaret moved back to town temporarily, helping us navigate the aftershocks. "She did the same to me when I inherited Dad's business share," she explained to Mark one evening. "Not as extreme, but the same patterns. I always wondered if she'd escalate with someone else." "Why didn't you warn me?" Mark asked, not accusingly, just searching. "Would you have believed me?" Margaret replied gently. "Could anyone have convinced you your mother was dangerous before you saw it yourself?" He had no answer. Neither did I. The months that followed were quieter but heavy with grief. Mark's brothers eventually reached out, some with halting apologies, others just testing if connection was still possible. Mark responded with cautious kindness but maintained firm boundaries. "They enabled her for decades," he explained when I asked if he'd forgive them. "I'm not closing the door forever, but I won't pretend this never happened either." We implemented Margaret's suggestion to create a family trust for our properties, with additional legal protections against future claims. The cabin we'd fought so hard over became our weekend sanctuary, a place to heal from wounds too deep for daily conversation. Sometimes at night I still wake to find Mark checking the locks, reviewing security camera footage, testing the car brakes. Trauma leaves traces that logic can't erase, but each day brings more moments of peace than the one before. 6 months after the courthouse incident, we received word that Patricia had been transferred to a long-term care facility. Her doctors reported she was responding to treatment, but still maintained that Mark was being controlled by me, still believed our property was rightfully hers. "Do you want to visit her?" I asked Mark that evening. He considered it genuinely before shaking his head. "Not yet, maybe not ever, and I need to be okay with that." I nodded, understanding the courage it took to prioritize his own well-being over family obligation. In the garden where we sat, new growth had replaced what winter had taken, resilient, if somewhat differently shaped than before. "You know what I've realized?" Mark said, reaching for my hand. "We spent so much energy fighting for our property, but what we were really fighting for was the right to choose our own path, to build a partnership where neither of us surrenders our identity." I squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of his words. The deed to our home was just paper. The cabin was just wood and stone. What mattered was that we had defended our right to build a life based on mutual respect rather than control and submission. Some people will never understand choosing partnership over dominance. Some family ties, no matter how ancient or sacred, become chains that must be broken for survival. The true test of love isn't what someone claims to feel, but how they act when you assert your boundaries. Mark's mother may never accept our marriage or my place in his life. His family may never fully recognize the damage they enabled. But we found a strength neither of us knew we possessed: the courage to stand against those who claim to love us while trying to break us. And in that painful, necessary battle, we discovered that peace is worth fighting for, even when the enemy wears the face of family. In the aftermath of Patricia's psychiatric commitment, Mark and I needed to rebuild, not just our sense of safety, but our very understanding of what family meant. We sat in our living room one rainy Sunday, surrounded by property listings from towns we'd never visited. "What about this one?" Mark pointed to a small arts community 3 hours away. Far enough that she couldn't just show up, close enough we could still see Margaret occasionally. The decision to sell both properties, our home and the cabin we'd fought so fiercely for, wasn't easy. Those walls contained our history, our struggles, our triumph, but they also held memories now tainted by Patricia's obsession. Every corner of that cabin whispered of her attempts to control us. Every room in our home felt like it had been violated by her plans to rent it out from under us. "I think we need to start fresh," I said finally. "Somewhere she's never been. Somewhere that's just ours." Mark nodded, his eyes reflecting both loss and hope. "I've been thinking the same thing." We found a modest craftsman house in a town, small enough that newcomers were noticed, but large enough that we weren't the only story. The front porch had a swing facing east, catching morning light that spilled across weathered wooden planks. The backyard wasn't large, but it had an ancient oak tree that seemed to stand guard over the property. "This one," we both said simultaneously when we first walked through. Moving day came 6 weeks later. As we loaded the last boxes, Margaret stopped by with a housewarming gift, a handcrafted wind chime made from copper pipes and sea glass. "For your new beginning," she said, hugging us both. "I'm so proud of you two." The first night in our new home, we slept with windows open, listening to that wind chime sing in the gentle breeze. It was the first time in months neither of us woke from nightmares. Recovery wasn't instantaneous. Mark continued therapy twice weekly, gradually processing the lifetime of manipulation he'd endured. I found myself jumping at unexpected knocks, installing perhaps more security cameras than necessary, checking locks compulsively before bed. "It's normal," our therapist assured us during our joint sessions. "Your sense of safety was fundamentally violated. Trust takes time to rebuild." 3 months into our new life, I noticed a vacant storefront while walking downtown. The space was small but warm, with exposed brick walls and tall windows that bathed the interior in natural light. A handwritten sign in the window simply read, "Release." I'd always dreamed of opening a bookstore. Before Patricia, before the legal battles, before fear became our constant companion, I'd shared that dream with Mark on our third date. "You should do it," Mark said that evening when I mentioned seeing the space. "We've spent so long fighting against something. Maybe it's time to build towards something instead." 6 weeks later, Turning Page Books opened its doors. I curated shelves of fiction and philosophy, poetry and memoir, stories of resilience and reinvention. The community embraced us, not knowing our full history but sensing perhaps that we were people rebuilding. Mark found work consulting remotely for his former company, grateful his skills didn't require returning to the city where his mother and brothers still lived. On Thursday afternoons, he'd bring me coffee and sit in the reading nook of my shop, watching customers browse with quiet contentment in his eyes. "You know what I realized today?" he said one evening as we walked home together. "I can't remember the last time I felt afraid." I squeezed his hand, understanding the magnitude of that simple statement. We received occasional updates about Patricia through Margaret. The treatment facility reported improvements in her condition, though her core delusions about property and control remained largely intact. Mark's brothers had divided into camps. 2 maintained complete loyalty to their mother, visiting weekly and echoing her narrative about me being the villain. The youngest had begun his own therapy, tentatively reaching out to Mark with halting apologies and questions about his childhood that showed he was beginning to recognize the dysfunction they'd grown up with. "Do you miss them?" I asked Mark one night. "I miss who I thought they were," he answered after consideration. "I miss the family I imagined we could be, but I don't miss who they actually are." On the anniversary of the courthouse incident, we took the day off and drove to a nearby lake. Sitting by the shoreline, watching sunlight dance across rippling water, I found myself reflecting on everything we'd endured. "You know what I've learned through all this?" I said, drawing patterns in the sand beside our picnic blanket. "Survival takes more than just being right. It's not enough to have logic on your side or legal documents in your name. Sometimes survival means standing your ground when everyone else expects you to yield. Sometimes it means fighting back, even when your opponent is family." Mark nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "I used to think family meant unconditional acceptance. Now I understand it means unconditional respect. My mother never respected either of us as autonomous people with our own choices." "Do you think she'll ever change?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "No," he said simply. And that's the hardest truth to accept. Some people are incapable of seeing others as anything but extensions of themselves. I leaned my head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of lake water and pine trees. "I'm proud of us, for getting away, for rebuilding, for not letting her win." "She thought property was power," Mark mused, "but real power was what we found. The strength to walk away and build something new." Later that evening, standing on our porch, watching fireflies illuminate the gathering dusk, I felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. The wind chime Margaret gave us sang softly in the evening breeze. I've come to understand that sometimes protecting ourselves means facing those who claim to love us but seek to control instead. True strength isn't found in property deeds or family names. It comes from standing up for respect and love, even when that means losing people who never truly supported us. Some family ties are worth preserving at all costs. Others become shackles that must be broken for survival. In the end, peace is worth fighting for. Our small house in this new town isn't grand. My bookstore isn't making us rich, but we found something priceless. The freedom to define our own life, our own family, our own meaning of home. And I've learned that survival requires courage beyond logic, the courage to recognize when love has become poison, and the strength to seek antidotes rather than building tolerance for the toxin. Sometimes the happy ending isn't what you originally pictured. Sometimes it's better. Sometimes protecting ourselves means facing those who claim to love us but seek control instead. True strength comes from standing up for respect and love, even if it means losing people who never truly supported us. In the end, Peace is worth fighting for, and survival requires courage beyond logic.